Thanks for being here. Welcome. My name's Drew Mogler. I have the pleasure of being on staff with the Iowa Pork Producers Association and handle our public policy efforts at the state and federal level, as well as our environmental programs. So unfortunately, I have to spend a lot of time talking to attorneys about these issues, but fortunately, we are blessed to have Eldon McAfee and his team at Gentry to help us with that. I'm sure a lot of you know Eldon, but I'll give a little bit of background on him. He graduated from Iowa State University in farm operations back when they still had farm op, and then he farmed for a while before attending Drake University Law. And he was with the Des Moines law firm of Beving, Swanson, and Forrest for more than 23 years before several years ago him and his colleagues Julie Viscoso and Aaron Herbold joined the Gentry law firm and formed their agricultural law group. And Eldon provides legal counsel to the Iowa Pork Producers Association, the Iowa Cattlemen's Association, the Iowa Poultry Association, other farm organizations, as well as individual livestock and crop farmers across the state of Iowa. So we're gonna switch things up from our typical format a little bit. Usually we just let Eldon get up here and drone on for about an hour or so, but we're gonna give him a shot for about 10-15 minutes to give you an update on some of the nuisance cases, and then him and I are going to retire to these nice, fancy, comfortable chairs and have a coffee chat with Eldon, is how they've bid this, which I thought we could have put a little bit more creativity into the title of calling it Lattes with the Lawyer, or Espressos with the Esquire, or Macchiatos with McAfee, but I guess we'll do a coffee chat with Eldon. So without further ado, Eldon, come on up, kick things off, and then we'll keep this thing going. So.
All right. Thank you, Drew. Everybody hear me okay? My first question is, I don't go to a lot of other talks, but who do they pick on when a lawyer's not on the program? I mean, the bill just goes up the more he gives me grief. I have been told for every minute I go over my allotted time standing here, they deduct it from next year's. So next year may be a very short program. But anyway, all right, let's get moving with this. We have, first of all, welcome. Glad you can make it here this morning. And, you know, often I get pigeonholed, as you can tell, various ways. But I have broad shoulders. I can take it. Anyway, I don't get to give good news very often. You know, how many lawyers ever give you good news? But we do have some good news on the nuisance case front, you know, and knock on wood, I've said that before in past years, and then the roof caves in. But we're going to talk about nuisance cases for a little bit here, and then we'll get into your questions, we'll get into DNR regulations, we'll get into some lawsuits that are going on, and some regulatory matters. First of all, if you have questions, please raise your hand at the time you have the question. I'm glad to take them as we go. Starting off with, there are handouts at the back of the room. If you didn't get one as you came in, raise your hand and we'll have someone bring you one. But if you have it, that's great. All right, let's go into the first one. I've done a lot of slides over the years for this presentation, and I've never done a table of contents before. Since Drew cut me back on time, I thought I'll get even with him. I will give you loads and loads of slides. Now seriously, you have way more slides than we're going to cover today, but I do want you to have this information available to you in case you have a question, etc. And I thought, well, rather than have you sort through all this stuff and find them, I thought, well, I'll put a table up front. Hopefully it's helpful. Hopefully it's accurate as I move slides around. But this gives you an overview of what's in the slides. We have nuisance, then DNR rules. Then Drew and I, depending on the questions from you, we'll get into a couple of lawsuits, ICCI v. Iowa on regarding the Raccoon River, and then the Iowa Ag Fraud Law and the Iowa Ag Trespass Law, which are not really environmental regulation, but something of great concern to livestock producers. And then a little bit on county zoning. All of this depending on time. But if you look at that, if you have any questions on those, please feel free to ask as we, I'll try not to have a swig of coffee in my mouth when you ask the question, okay? All right, I'm using up my time. I got to keep moving. All right, first slide, slide 3, nuisance lawsuits. I'm going to talk about two recent that were in 2019. I've got two slides on that, one on each case. And then I've got a summary slide there. You also have a handout here today, in addition to the slides, you have a handout of a nuisance case chart. I've got a slide, but we're going to talk about this. What is the trend? What has happened? Where are we going? Fortunately for Iowa, I think we're doing better on that front than some other areas of the country, and we hope that continues. I just want you to have that information, and I'm not going to make any predictions. I'm not going to say, hey, here's why this has happened, here's why it hasn't happened. I'm just going to lay the facts out for you. Two cases. One, slide 3, Buchanan County. Anyone from that area? This is a cattle feed yard that went to trial just concluded last January, right before Pork Congress. I talked about it briefly last year. 800 head cattle yard, two neighbors across the road, 500 feet away. When I say across the road, I mean across the road, directly across the road from this cattle yard. And went to a jury trial in Buchanan County, and after about 5 days of testimony, the jury came back and found that it was not a nuisance. Maybe in our discussion we'll get into a few more of the facts there, but the jury, again, presented testimony about odor and flies causing a nuisance for these two neighbors across the road, heard from other witnesses, some who lived in the house right next to the feed yard as tenants, and they testified it didn't cause them any problems. One of the tenants that lived in the house even had her wedding in the backyard, and said no complaints from guests. We had a nice wedding. And again, the jury, hearing that testimony, found it was not a nuisance and did not award any money to the plaintiffs. Okay? Next case. This case went to trial last year right after Pork Congress. February in Mount Pleasant, Henry County. And here we had 4,992 head swine finishers located, if you can, I have a map of this, but we don't have it in the slides. North-South Road, 4,992 head finisher here, half a mile, or 2,500, a little over right at a half a mile south, another one, and then a little over a half a mile south of that, another one. Went to trial. The neighbors, 3 residences sued. I have this in the slide there. One lived a mile northwest, one lived a little over a mile and a half north, and then another one a mile and a half northeast. After a 3-week trial, and I won't go into details what the weather was like last year in Mount Pleasant, Iowa in February, but we had several days where the jury couldn't come in because of ice, etc., so a trial got lengthened. Anyway, jury deliberated for about a day and a half, or more like a day, and found no nuisance. Heard testimony from neighbors two neighbors who lived closer than any of the plaintiffs, and testified. One neighbor testified who lived about a half a mile north of the North Swine Finisher, testified that his wife and daughter liked to jog, run. She was on the track team in high school, and they actually ran right by these swine finishers, and at times they would walk up and take a look in the curtains to see the little pigs, etc. Found it. The husband testified that there was no problem for any of them. Odor, yeah, they got some odor, but wasn't a nuisance for them, wasn't a problem. And the jury, hearing that testimony and other testimony, ruled that it was not a nuisance. Okay, slide 5. Here's the summary. And this is where this sheet comes in. And what I want to say here is, if you take the front side of this sheet, okay, and it flips, but if you take the side with the caption at the top that says Iowa Ag Nuisance Cases, on my slide here, I first of all have 1994 to 2019, 14 cases have went to trial that I'm aware of, and it's my job to be aware of them, so I hope I'm aware of them all. But go down to the next bullet point on that slide, 1994 to 2000, that's the front side of this sheet. 6 swine cases and 1 grain case, and 6 verdicts finding a nuisance. And you have all the details in this chart about how much money was awarded, some of it went up on appeal, etc. Then we go flip the page and go to the back side. That's the next part of that slide, the bottom bullet point, 2008 to 2019. 7 trials, 4 swine, 3 cattle, on the swine side, 3 verdicts finding no nuisance and 1 verdict finding a nuisance. That includes those 2 trials I just talked about. 3 cattle cases and no verdicts finding an odor nuisance. One of the cattle trials had a runoff part of it to it, and the jury did find that there was some runoff that caused damage. But from the odor and flies part of it, no nuisance. So out of those 7 trials, 6 no nuisance and 1 nuisance. Okay? And the last 3 trials, in 2016 and 2 in 2019, the juries, different counties, found no nuisance. So we're hopeful that's a trend. My point to you would be, if you're a producer, if you're working with producers, keep up the good work. And what would be the good work we'd like to see you keep up? Oh, let's talk about what's coming. Here's a list. It's slide 6. You have that in your materials. These are the cases that I'm aware of that are pending. We have one coming up February 18th in Iowa County, another one in June in Jefferson County, and then another one in July in Lynn County. Then we have one in U.S. District Court in Northwest Iowa that has a lot of components to it, claims of nuisance, but also violations of, there's about every alphabet, letter in the alphabet, RCRA, Clean Water Act, etc. I won't go into detail about that case. And then Mitchell County, we have one on cattle feedlot runoff. Okay, what can we do? Slide 7. What can we do to keep this trend going and maybe make it better? What would be better than winning a nuisance lawsuit, not being in a nuisance lawsuit? And I've said, my point is, the best nuisance lawsuit you can prepare for is the one that never gets filed, like a lot of things. So what can we do? Now, I have said before on slide 7, you as a producer, you as a consultant can advise a producer to do every one of these things, and I can tell you some of that list of nuisance trials I just gave you, they did pretty much every one of these things and still got sued. Doesn't guarantee it, but taking these steps, we hope, gives you a lot better chance of never having to talk to people like me to defend you and don't end up in court. Location, location, location. Tree buffers, building ventilation management. What am I talking about there? Those of you in the business know that good ventilation means what for those pigs? They're comfortable. What does a comfortable pig do? They don't cause problems. They don't lay in their manure to stay cool. They are comfortable. So I've had attorneys on the other side in these cases say, you spend more money on taking care of those pigs than you do on making sure the neighbors are not experiencing unreasonable odors. And our response in trial has been, no, you're missing the point. Keeping those pigs comfortable reduces odor, means less odor for the neighbors. So the first step, by keeping the pigs comfortable, sure, that helps our bottom line. That's what we're in business for. But it also is an odor control measure. So building ventilation management, manage it. The manure storage and application, clean livestock and buildings and lots, I've talked about that. Mortality handling, if you're rendering, composting, whatever you're doing, mortalities are something that are a lightning rod to neighbors. Let's talk about composting. What is composting? And I'll probably live to regret hearing these words. Somebody will repeat them to me. But you take dead pigs, you put them in a pile, let them rot. That's composting. Now, okay, how do you do it? You use the proper bulking agent. You keep them covered. They're properly done. Composting does not cause an odor problem nor a fly problem. Composting is a very good way, biosecurity-wise, to handle our mortalities. You just have to make sure you properly manage that compost. And then just overall operational environmental management, including neighbor awareness, etc. I think we'll probably get into some of this in our talk. Insurance, slide 8, I'm not selling it, but it can be a very big help from risk management for producers to have some protection from nuisance lawsuits. Your standard farm liability policies don't normally cover it. If you have a concern here, there are people upstairs that handle these products here at the trade show. Contact your local agent first, I would encourage you to do. and see if they have it. And if they don't, they can help you find it. Again, I'm not selling it, but it is a very good risk management tool. How about a law? Don't we need a law to stop nuisance lawsuits? Well, our Iowa Supreme Court has said we're the only state in the country that's had the Iowa Supreme Court find a right to farm law unconstitutional, and they've done it twice, actually a third time to reinforce one of the first times. But anyway, we do have laws on the books that can help in certain situations, and one of those laws, slide 10, was just adopted in 2017. I'll leave that for your reading. It is available, but my point is, go back to this slide, slide 7, steps you can take to hopefully avoid a lawsuit. Any questions? Drew, do we move on to the next phase? How did I do? All right, no time deducted for next year? Not at this point, he says. All right, any questions as we will move on to, we're going to talk more about nuisance cases. If you have questions, I'll move over here with Drew and take a drink of coffee.
Any questions before we dive into some other issues? Okay. You did a very comprehensive and nice job on that, Eldon.
All right.
And appreciate you diving into some of that stuff. Was there any other last-minute things you wanted to talk on nuisance before we maybe talk about some other environmental issues?
Okay, still hear me all right? Okay. You know, again, nuisance cases to me, this is a chat, right?
This is right. This is a chat.
Some people think, why would a lawyer want to help you avoid a nuisance case? Okay? Yes, I make part of my living defending these cases. And I've been on the winning side, and I've been on the losing side. And I like the winning side a lot better. But, and I don't have a halo above my head here. I'm in business like you are. But the best thing for you, and the best thing for me as an attorney, is if you can avoid the nuisance cases. And that slide I gave, I know it's rather vague. I'd be glad to talk to any individually about some of those practices. Just, as I said, the best case, nuisance case is the one you can avoid. But you can also, and some of you may know some of the people who are on that list who have been through the trial or may have one coming up. Often all those things are done, and you still find yourself in the soup. So, but if you don't do all those things, your chances of ending up in a nuisance case, pardon me, are much better. I could go into a lot of details about jury. How many of you have been on a jury? Whoa, no one. Oh, I guess a couple. Don't worry, I'm not going to call you out. But for those of you who have been on a jury, I don't know what the case was about, but what I try and emphasize to producers in nuisance cases, any case, our jury system is the best society has ever came up with in ever how many years. But boy, your fate is in the hands of 8 people. There, I just heard a chuckle. Sometimes, we like to think those jurors make decisions based only on the evidence presented. We like to think they don't bring their history with them. We like to think they aren't influenced by what they've read in the paper previous to this case. Not about the case, but just in general. We like to think all that, and we certainly hope that is the case. But people are human, of course, and when, the jury system is a very good system, but again, I guess I keep coming back to no one wants to go through that, and if you can do everything you can to avoid that, even when you win, there's still a high cost to nuisance lawsuits. Now, there's going to be a presentation later this morning from about North Carolina and what they've went through and the very large verdicts down there, and I sincerely feel for the people going through that down there, the farmers who, the pork producers who are really pretty much seeing their livelihood flash in front of their eyes, right? And we hope the best for them. As we look at Iowa, yes, that hasn't happened here, and we hope it doesn't happen, but it could, and we just sincerely hope everybody will keep paying attention as you have been to location, size of the operation, pay attention to just good management and neighbor relations. Should you talk to your neighbors? Certainly. And here's one point one point I want to make about talking to neighbors. Talk to all your neighbors, not just the neighbors that you're pretty sure will be okay with it. Nobody likes to drive into that neighbor's yard, and I'm talking about before you build, after you build, neighbor relations. Nobody likes to talk to that neighbor that you're pretty sure is not happy about it. But you need to talk to all of them, and sometimes it pays dividends, and I'll be honest, sometimes it doesn't. But if you only talk to the neighbors who are supportive, I can tell you the trials I've been in, that will be a problem. So communicate with your neighbors, even those that aren't in your corner, so to speak. Let them know that, hey, you're there, you understand they aren't happy, but you're still going to keep talking to them and offer to be a good neighbor. It's up to them whether they accept that.
I think the point Eldon's giving is don't just give hams around Christmas times to the neighbors that are nice to you. Give them to all of your neighbors, which will help you with neighbor relations. And Lord knows we also need plenty of help moving hams as well. So the more hams we can distribute in our neighborhood is helpful as well.
And I'll cut in, it's up to them whether they accept it. They may order you off their place or not, but at least you tried, and it'll pay dividends, believe me.
So Jamie is up here with her fancy question box. So if you do have a question throughout our coffee chat this morning, feel free to give her a wave, and she will lightly toss or walk it to if you have a question, and feel free to flag her down as we go through here. If you have a question that comes up at any time, please feel free. Let's pivot off nuisance a little bit, Eldon, and talk about EPA work plan. This has been a issue that's been festering in the state of Iowa since 2007 when EPA was petitioned, alleging that the Iowa DNR was not properly implementing their NPDES permit system, and that it was not in compliance with the Clean Water Act. And so essentially the petitioners were asking that EPA would take over from DNR their current oversight of that program. And so in 2013, DNR signed this agreement with EPA to execute a work plan that dealt with desktop analysis and looking at all of Iowa's livestock farms with more than 300 animal units. We've had some developments in that work plan here in 2019. Why don't you talk a little bit about some of that? I know you've got some slides in there as well.
Funny you should ask, Drew. I won't go to it on the PowerPoint. It's slide 11. Well, let me start with, and I can be as sarcastic as the best of them. Has everyone read the extensive media accounts from, let's say some certain statewide newspaper about how the EPA conducted this, this fight? I'll get in trouble, but what the heck. That EPA conducted this, and DNR, this 5-year review of all the livestock operations in Iowa and found not a single problem with discharges, which was the complaint of those that asked for that filed this petition. You've all read that story, right? No, hasn't been a single story about it. This report by EPA came out in April, or earlier this year. I was looking for it in my slide, don't I? April 3rd, 2019, slide 11. EPA, after all this process, 2007, they filed a petition. We make changes to Iowa law as required by EPA regarding discharges. That's all this was about. 5-year work plan. All of you, if you have a hog building, cattle feed yard, should have either had an on-site inspection or an inspection done by DNR, what they called, on the computer, looking at aerial images, etc. Every operation, certainly above the SAFO threshold of 500 animal units, was to be inspected. My understanding is they have been, and then they've been around to some of the smaller ones. Like everyone was inspected. We had, let's see, in my slide 12, and then in slide 11, I'm looking as I talk here, they looked for unauthorized discharges. No, none. Okay? How many NPDES permits were required as a result of this 5-year work plan and all these inspections? 0. Why? Number one, confinements can't discharge by law. Okay? Surprise. We didn't find any. 2, my bias isn't showing through at all, is it here? Okay. And what about accidental discharges? What if there is a hose that breaks when you're applying manure? That's a discharge. Absolutely. Federal EPA takes a position that as long as you correct in an accidental discharge, if you correct whatever caused the discharge, then no NPDES permit is required. So that's what DNR does. If you're the unfortunate recipient of a DNR order after an accidental discharge, hose breaks, whatever it is, yeah, you'll get fined, most likely, but your order will say that you've done this, you've corrected it, that's why. So, good news, folks. After all that, and EPA has issued their final report, again, April 3rd of this year, and DNR passed with flying colors. Now, could that be challenged? Certainly it can still be challenged, but at this point, and again, we've passed the work plan. DNR is still conducting surveys in certain parts of the states looking for the smaller buildings that aren't required by law to have a manure management plan, etc. So that can still be occurring. But very good news on the EPA work plan front. But I'll finish like I do with the nuisance lawsuits. Don't let our guard down. Believe me, those that are opposed to what we do for a living aren't letting their guard down. Keep up good work. I think, again, the whole industry deserves kudos for what we did in the work plan.
And there was another part of that too, Eldon. There was another article that showed up at one point talking about how there had been thousands of previously undiscovered or unknown animal feeding operations that were out there that DNR had missed. They forgot to count them. They weren't in the DNR database, and so DNR went through and vetted some of those. And so, can you talk a little bit about how many of those were out of compliance? I mean, this was something where they were kind of alleging or framing it up in the way that, there was, 6,000 or 5,000 additional animal feeding operations in the state that DNR had no idea were there. They took a look and looked at that. What was the result?
Slide 12, I did put that on the screen there, Drew. I cheated. As you can see there, 7/31/18, so coming up on 2 years, they had got through half of them. 99.4% were either in complete compliance with state law, or they weren't even animal feeding operations. This is anecdotal information. I would get called. Some of them, DNR would look for these using aerial imagery. Some were machine sheds. Some were whatever, or had been at livestock buildings, didn't have livestock in them. DNR did their job as required by EPA, looked into those, and 99.4% were not required to be regulated, and the 0.6 were some needed MMPs. Granted, they didn't have them, they got them, etc. But none were discharging to a water of the state, which was this whole purpose. So again, you haven't seen that article from the media either about how those 5,000, it was a big splash of an article when DNR released that there were 5,000 that were not in their system. Oh my God, we have 5,000 we didn't even know about. Well, we haven't, they've looked into it. They have since, I have a 7/31/18. The final report by EPA noted that DNR was working on those, and my understanding is they're pretty much all through what they need to look at and have found no problems as far as discharges. All right?
Very good. Any other questions on EPA work plan from anyone, or any other questions that are popping up? Okay, let's talk about a lawsuit that was filed last year in the state of Iowa. There were several activist organizations, ICCI, Food and Water Watch. Obviously, we've been familiar with a lot of activities that ICCI has been in the state for a while. Food and Water Watch, they're based out of Washington, D.C., and have had a presence in Iowa here more recently over the past few years. They filed a lawsuit against the state of Iowa, several of the agencies, the DNR, the Department of Ag. They're saying that the state of Iowa violated its duty to protect the Raccoon River for the benefit of the people. And so what the plaintiffs are asking for in this case, they're claiming that the state failed to protect them under their constitutional right to due process and the public trust doctrine. And so talk a little bit about what the plaintiffs are seeking for relief in this case, and talk a little bit about, we'll give you a chance to get into a little bit of legal philosophy, talking about public trust doctrine lawsuits and what exactly that means.
If I do that, they are going to need coffee. So slide 42, it's in your materials, it's up on the screen. The way I describe this is, remember the Des Moines Water Works lawsuit that was filed several years ago? This is pretty, and the attorneys in the room, if there are any, and I know there's one here, but anyway, legally and technically it's not Des Moines Water Works number 2, but from a practical standpoint, I believe it is. The Des Moines Water Works lawsuit was dismissed because a federal, or the Iowa State Supreme Court found that drainage districts and trustees of drainage districts don't have legal authority to control discharges from the land within the district. That's not what Iowa law does. Then the federal court, quote unquote, dismissed the lawsuit because there was no control over that land. Okay, this lawsuit, as we lay out here, the essence of this lawsuit is these groups are claiming that the state of Iowa, Iowa DNR, Iowa Environmental Protection Commission, Iowa Department of Agriculture, who have I missed? Iowa Natural Resources Council, are not, and the Iowa legislature and the Iowa governor, is anybody I missed, is not doing their job to protect the public. And it's what I would call an ancient legal doctrine. It's been used at various times throughout legal history. But the argument is, when the elected branches of government are not protecting the public, the courts should step in under the public trust doctrine and order those branches of government to do something that they haven't done. Now, normally it comes up in different contexts, such as when the government's trying to sell something that quote unquote belongs to the public and somebody steps in and challenges. There are other challenges. It hasn't been used in the environmental context, and the one time it was tried to be used in, some other states it has, Iowa has not, was tried to be used under climate change here a few years ago, and the court rejected that. That's the lawsuit we have pending here. These groups have petitioned the judge and or have filed a lawsuit, I should say, claiming that these elected branches of government are not doing their job. The primary focus is the nutrient reduction strategy, which is a voluntary strategy, a voluntary requirement, as you know, and they're alleging that it should not be voluntary. This lawsuit, a little different than the Des Moines Water Works lawsuit, is also taking aim at livestock a little more. And they have asked for, this is on slide 42, and I realize the print's a little small in your handout, but they are asking for a moratorium in the Raccoon River watershed. At this point, we'll, if we need to, we can get into whether, if they are successful, will it spread? Of course it will. But they are asking for a moratorium on, during the pendency of this lawsuit, that the judge grant a moratorium on any new or existing livestock operations in that watershed being built, new, or expanded. Plus, if they win the lawsuit, they want that moratorium to be in place until there's a remedial plan put in place by the elected branches of government if the court orders it. One of the interesting things about this lawsuit is, and I'm not just talking from an attorney standpoint, but it filed in Polk County, deals with the Raccoon River, and they've asked for a jury trial. Where will the jury be drawn from? Because it's in state court, the jury will be drawn from Polk County. I better stop there. Okay? All right. You see where I'm headed with this? Okay. Polk County jury, Where do they, Des Moines Water Works, asking them to order, what they want the Polk County jury to do is find that the public trust doctrine has been violated. Imagine those jury instructions, those of you who have been on a jury, explaining what the public trust doctrine is and having a jury decide that. And they want the jury to declare that the nutrient reduction strategy, which was put in place with legislation, but it is a voluntary strategy, that it is void. That's what we have has been filed. Okay, but there's more to the story. The Attorney General defends this one because it's against the state. The Attorney General, as is up on the slide, filed a motion to dismiss. Various legal theories. I won't get into those. And the judge here in Polk County denied it. Said, no, you don't meet the requirements for a motion to dismiss. The lawsuit can proceed. The Attorney General's office then asked for an appeal to the Iowa Supreme Court of that decision by the judge to not dismiss it. Have I got enough negatives in there? I think. Anyway, the Iowa Supreme Court, on an appeal like that, it's what we call an interlocutory appeal, which is before final judgment, doesn't have to take the appeal. The Iowa Supreme Court could have said, wait till you go through trial, and if you still have a problem, then come back to us. No, the Iowa Supreme Court accepted the request for an appeal of the district court's dismissal, see, I got myself mixed up. The district court did not dismiss the lawsuit. So that, then the Attorney General appealed that, and the Iowa Supreme Court said, we're going to take a look at that. Should that lawsuit have been dismissed? How will the Iowa Supreme Court rule? We don't know. This will, nothing moves fast in the court system. We have the Attorney General filed their brief in December. Several agricultural groups have filed a brief in support of the Attorney General, arguing that it should be dismissed. The Iowa Pork Producers Association is part of that group, and this is all public record, along with the Iowa Cattlemen's Association and other farm groups, and if I try and name them, I will miss one, so I will just name the two livestock groups I can think of: Iowa Poultry Association, Iowa Farm Bureau. Anyway, those briefs have been filed. Yesterday, the opposing side then files their brief arguing it shouldn't be dismissed. The district court judge was correct. That's their argument. And I haven't had a chance to look, but several briefs were filed in support of them by various groups, including 4 law professors who argue that, from the Drake University Law School, who argue that it should not be dismissed, and they're supporting ICCI, etc. So I don't know that we have enough attorneys involved. We may get a few more, but that's where it stands right now. Drew,
so essentially what we're waiting for, the Supreme Court is to make a decision on if they agree with if the Supreme Court agrees with the Attorney General, this case would be dismissed, correct?
Correct.
And that's what we're hoping for anyway. And so, along with a lot of other legal philosophies that were laid out in the brief that Iowa Pork was part of, essentially we made the argument that you can't ask the judicial court to legislate or create legislation if you have been unsuccessful at getting legislation through the legislative branch of the government. And so, along with the fact that the livestock industry in the state of Iowa is already subject to some of the most pervasive environmental regulations, I believe was Eldon's terms in the brief, in this state. And so we'll be keeping a close eye on that one. And
It is a big deal legally. Can the court order the legislature to do something here? And it boils down to the argument of the separation of powers that we all learned back in government. And yeah, okay. What grade were you in, Drew?
great. Whenever we all first saw Schoolhouse of Rock or whatever.
There we go. The argument, and again, I'm going to show my bias, but the point is the elected branch of government, elected by whom? Us. Right? Has decided this is what we are going to do. The voluntary nutrient reduction strategy, the pervasive regulation of livestock, etc. Those that filed the lawsuit are arguing that That's not enough, and to be fair to them, they are arguing that there is law to support them. They are arguing to the court, or will, that clearly doesn't meet the standard of the public trust. So it's a very important lawsuit. You're sitting there thinking, okay, what's it mean to me when I go home and do chores tonight or whatever? Keep doing the good job you're doing, and I guess stay tuned. If you have any questions, let me know. But follow the rules as you've done according to the DNR EPA work plan, etc. And we'll keep you. There are a lot of people involved in this, keeping a close eye on it and participating.
So when a lawsuit like this comes up, are there statistics, or does it even matter, on industrial runoff, municipal runoff, homeowners from their lawns, golf courses, etc. runoff? Is it ever measured or entered into the discussion on these lawsuits?
Okay, everybody hear the question, I assume, to get that. What's the best way I can answer that? Yes, it'll enter into the discussion. It will be pointed out, and has been pointed out, the other sources of pollution, etc. But to me, it's kind of like when one person gets caught out of compliance of whatever it is. I do a lot of federal farm program work, and I'm just using that as an example. And my clients often say, well, yeah, my residue wasn't enough, but my gosh, go down the road and look at the neighbor, and he didn't get caught, or she, and the government usually just says, well, we're dealing with you right now, and if you tell us who that neighbor is, we'll go get them. And so my point is they're focusing on us right now. Us being agriculture, we're the target. Are there other sources? Yes, but they're focusing on us, and we have to defend ourselves based on what we do. As much as we can, we'll interject that, hey, there's a lot of other sources, but unfortunately, they're focusing on us right now. Does that make sense? Well, it probably doesn't make sense, but.
Well, I think that was one of the big points of the brief that our group supported, was very much supporting the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy, which acknowledges that there's non-point source and there's point source pollution in the state of Iowa, and it requires this comprehensive strategy to be able to tackle those issues. There's something that everybody in the state of Iowa can do to improve water quality. It's not just on one group or another group to be able to do this by themselves. And so that was one of the big points that we really relied on in that brief, is that the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy is a comprehensive strategy that includes everybody, and everybody working together to work towards that. So I think that does play well to that we're all in this together and have to work together on that.
Drew, can we take a look at DNR regulation here? I want to make sure that there is one new rule from DNR that I want all of you to be aware of. And if you look at your handy-dandy contents there on page 1 of, it's under new common ownership definition, slide 26. And, whoops, there we go. All right. I have a lot of background slides here leading up to this, but this comes down to what is one operation or two? One confinement, that's what we're talking about here. You have a confinement building here and a confinement building here. When are they put together, and you add the animal units together to determine if you need a manure management plan or if you need a permit, etc. Or when are they separate? Well, two operations under common ownership or common management, an or in there, are one if they're within a certain distance. And so this question comes up a lot. What is common ownership? Well, the definition that was in DNR rules, is until February 19th. A majority ownership in, like if you have formed an LLC that owns one building, and then you form another LLC that owns another building that's within the distance, which is generally for like a permit is 2,500 feet. They're considered one if you have a majority, one person has a majority in both. There was a lot of, and Drew can join in here, a lot, and many of you know there was a lot of criticism from certain factions, I'll call it, about That was a loophole. Three people could form LLCs, different LLCs, and if they had equal ownership interests in each one of those LLCs, none of them had a majority, and they could build buildings side by side. And they'd be considered separate because it was separate ownership. They had to have separate management also, which means they couldn't be managing all those sites. And your eyes aren't glazing over yet, but it's getting close. So I'll move to the point. The Iowa Pork Producers Association had this brought to their attention that this was a problem. Can I point to any one place where I knew this was occurring? No, I don't think so. And when I get questions as attorney for the Iowa Pork Producers Association about can I split ownership and management and have buildings that will be considered separate even though they're close, I explain what the law says. And then I leave it up to those producers to make their decision. But this has been a hot button in years past. The majority ownership issue was coming up, so the Iowa Pork, Drew, I'll go ahead and explain it, but the Iowa Pork Producers Association voted, their board voted to file a petition for rulemaking. We asked for a rule. Now, a lot of people were scratching their head over that one. And that rule lowered the ownership threshold from majority to 10%. So, and it passed. The Iowa DNR proposed, when you file a petition for rulemaking, the Iowa DNR by law takes a look at it, and then they have to present it to the Iowa Environmental Protection Commission, a 9-member commission appointed by the governor, ratified by the Senate. 9 members, 3 of which have to be actively engaged in animal and crop agriculture. That commission looked at it, put it out for public comment, got some negative comments by some certain groups that said you didn't go near far enough, you should have made it much stricter, etc. But anyway, that rule is passed. The EPC voted to pass it in December. And beginning, as it says on the slide, for anything constructed after February 19th, 2020, this rule applies. So if you have those 3 LLCs, 3 members in each, and so they all have 33 1/3, then under this rule, that would be considered one site because they exceed the 10%. Anything already in place is grandfathered in. If I may, grandfather clause there on slide 27 doesn't apply to dry bedded confinement operations because they have their own statute in the Iowa Code, and it doesn't apply to open feedlots because they are under a separate section of DNR rules. Just want you all to be aware of that. If you have any questions, let Drew or me know now or give us a call about how that affects, again, this DNR rule goes into effect February 19th. Anything further on that, Drew?
No, I think that one covers it. And do you guys have any questions on that one? Or else I think I want to talk about another lawsuit, or a couple lawsuits that we're dealing with as well.
I think you like to talk about lawsuits more than I do.
But so this refers to one that deals with the law that got passed in Iowa back in 2012, the Ag Production Facility Fraud Law. So that made it illegal to gain employment under false pretenses and commit an act not authorized by an employer.
Okay. Should we? We're back at the end of the slides. I jumped around on you.
And so,
go ahead, I'll find the slides.
Yeah, so that law was on the books for 5 years before 2017. There was several groups that challenged the constitutionality of that law. And then it was working its way through the court systems, and then in the first or second week of January, just previous to Pork Congress last year, a federal judge ruled that law was in violation of the First Amendment's protection of free speech. And so the state is appealing that decision as we speak. And then in 2019, last year legislative session, the legislature passed a new law, the Ag Trespass Law, which was much more narrow in scope. And that is also currently being challenged in court. And maybe we could talk a little bit about the difference between those two laws and the status of what we're calling ALDF 1.0 and ALDF 2.0, and what does that mean for producers? What do we need to keep in mind as we operate our businesses?
Well, Drew, let's start with, and I'm not going to say these words, so you're going to have to say it, okay? What do these laws often get called?
Yeah, these are a lot of times referred to as ag-gag laws, which Eldon does not like saying. I don't know why you made me say those words.
I refuse to use that term.
But
that was
anyway.
a term coined by our opponents as a pejorative term, and I refuse to use it. It caught on, you see it, but I made Drew say it because now you all know what we're talking about, because that's what you hear. Anyway, now I'll talk. Okay. The Ag Fraud Law passed in 2012, as Drew said. I have a slide 43. We won't get into a lot of details here, but what are we talking about here? We're talking about people who seek employment using false information. The court actually uses the word lies, and then they take videos and put them out there and showing what they believe to be animal abuse, etc. The question is, can that be a crime? Can the state of Iowa make that a crime? And the law was passed in 2012, and there's on January 9th, just before Pork Congress last year, January 9, 2019, the court, responding to a lawsuit brought by those organizations, found that it was unconstitutional. Iowa's law was, because it violated free speech. Okay? So we have that decision. And so that law has been struck down. It is on appeal, but it can't be enforced right now during the appeal because there was an injunction granted. Drew's been he'll say he's not a lawyer, but he's hanging around us too much. Pretty soon he'll be de facto. So then, prior to that, and what do we care? I have the Idaho ag fraud law up there. What do we care about Idaho? Idaho's law, that portion of it was found constitutional by that appeals court, the Ninth Circuit. And those of you that follow courts at all, the Ninth Circuit is about as liberal as they come. And that portion was found constitutional. And there was a dissenting judge that would have went further, and I love what the dissenting judge pretty much said out there. He said, and he didn't dissent saying it should be unconstitutional. He dissented and said the whole thing should be constitutional. Property rights. These people are coming onto our property. It should be constitutional to make that a crime when they do something that's not authorized. But the rest of the court didn't go that far, but they did find that portion constitutional. So what does the state of Iowa do? Do I have the wrong date in there, Drew? I have 2017.
Yeah, the ag trespass should have been 2019 here, which was patterned similarly.
I'm sorry, I'm a little... oh, I see. That's here we go. Yeah, I have the wrong date. Make that change on slide 46 as 2019 Iowa ag trespass law. Sorry about that. Anyway, then we go to slide 47, and on December 2nd, 2019, well, let me back up. That law that was adopted just this spring, past spring, 2019, the ag trespass law, was, let's just say, modeled after Idaho, because if it worked in Idaho, it ought to work here. And the court had already found our law in 2012 to be unconstitutional. So the thought was, well, let's do what Idaho did, should be constitutional here. Well, on slide 47, on December 2nd, 2019, the U.S. District Court judge here found that our law, the 2019 law, well, let me back up. I almost misspoke. Granted an injunction against the law being enforced. Okay, at this point, it hasn't been finally determined it's unconstitutional, okay? But the judge granted an injunction against it being enforced. Said, in all likelihood, there is a great likelihood it will be unconstitutional. Hasn't made a final determination, but said during the lawsuit, which will take a while, it cannot be enforced by the state of Iowa. Okay? So, where does that leave us right now? I'm going to go to where we are right now. As of we sit here today, there is no law on the books in Iowa that can be enforced that makes it a crime for a person to use false pretenses to gain employment, and then saying, you know, who they are, what they can't. There's no law that can make that a crime. You can tell I'm stumbling here because I have my own thoughts. But anyway, where does that leave us right now? Number one, and this may be common sense, but sometimes common sense gets lost in all this. You don't have to hire those people. There's no law saying you have to hire them. This is not a protected class such as race, religion, etc. If when you're conducting employee interviews, and if you determine that that person is probably intending to take a video associated with an animal rights organization, etc., and you don't have to hire them. The law just says it can't be a penalty if you hire them and they do that. Okay, so be very careful in your hiring process, and I know you are. I know it's easier said than done, but be even more careful because there is no deterrent there from a law that makes it a crime for them to do that. That's the best advice I can give you right now. Now, we're going to talk about something we've seen here recently, and that is we have several instances recently where those opposed to the way we raise livestock have not went through the hiring process, but have entered, in 2 instances, swine buildings in the middle of the night and taken video. Okay? No permission to be there, not an employee. Did they break in? They entered the buildings, let's put it that way. And then they have, in one instance, posted that video on Facebook. Is that trespass? Is that a crime? Absolutely. The penalty, and I'm not a criminal lawyer, a penalty for trespass like that is, I believe, around $500. Okay? And in one instance, that person was charged with that crime and ordered to pay a penalty. But the video's on Facebook. Okay? Can we stop, if they have committed a crime, entered your private property illegally, can we somehow stop that information, that video, those pictures from being posted? No, can't. Remember that word, free speech? Can't do that. So, what we're here, Drew and I are here to tell you today is please be very vigilant on security, pardon me, security at your sites. Okay? There are those out there. We have the employment process, and we have just plain old trespass and going in your buildings, not talk about biosecurity. They certainly aren't filling out your forms and stating they followed your biosecurity policy. That has occurred, and we just wanted to let you know today, please be very vigilant and know that has occurred and take every precaution you can for building security. Okay? Any questions about that? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Oh, hold on. Anna.
Oh, I'm talking to the box. Okay. Did I hear you right that the fine there was only $500 for trespassing?
That's the fine I'm aware of.
Okay. So is there any efforts occurring to maybe revisit some of these fines and penalties? Because $500 seems to be a fairly small amount for the amount of economical damage that can happen to producer businesses when these videos get put out there.
I'm not aware of it now, but you might think that discussion might occur. And I'm not trying to be a smart aleck, but right now I'm not aware of it, any effort. But I understand what you're saying, pardon me, and I would agree with you. That's not much of a penalty.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've found most frustrating with the ag facility trespass law, the ag production facility fraud law, is that both of those bills passed with very broad bipartisan support in the state of Iowa from the legislature, from both parties. And unfortunately get a bad draw at the judicial level with judges who don't agree with that. And so, for the most part, the legislature in the state of Iowa supports the industry from being protected from these extremist groups out there with agendas. and it's been frustrating having to deal with these blows from the judicial level on that. But that's a good question, Anna. Is there any other questions before we wrap up here? We're getting close. I don't want. Well, we've already gone over a minute, Eldon, so that'll
Hold
be
on,
5 minutes
one more
deducted from
question.
–
2021.
That only applied to
Ready?
my portion at the podium, so I think I get extra time because of this.
Go ahead.
Do you have any update on the County Board of Supervisors and their submittals to ask the state to put on moratoriums?
Yeah, so we did deal with that a couple years ago where we had a slew of county boards of supervisors. Some of these groups were going around to the counties and asking them to sign on to these petitions to the governor or the legislature to put on moratoriums. We haven't seen as many of those. There's still some of those happening. And in some cases, we've been a lot more proactive in some of those hotspot areas of the state. We're reaching out to producers. Hey, invite your county board of supervisors out to the farm, talk to them about this kind of things. And so we've kind of identified some of those areas and helped quell that a little bit. But I think it's important to note also that the county boards of supervisors don't have jurisdiction over citing of those things. Obviously, if they're a county that has the master matrix and they have ability to provide input on that, but when it comes to approving or denying permits, that's still left up to the DNR.
If I have to, I have to add something, and then we will stop. Okay. Well, wait, does this get taken off if I talk?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Anyway, anybody here from Johnson County or near Johnson County? Okay. You may have, Johnson County, for those of you in eastern Iowa, has amended their ordinance, received their county ordinance. There is an ag exemption to county zoning. It applies to livestock buildings. You're exempt from county zoning. Johnson County has went through quite a process. Farmers, producers in Johnson County have been very active, going to meetings, etc. An ordinance has went into place that generally, well, there's still some issues whether it complies with Iowa law, but it's a lot better than what was initially proposed. But yeah, stay tuned. There may be more you hear about that if you're in the eastern Iowa area. But the bottom line, Drew said it, I just said it, under Iowa law, counties have, under two different laws, counties have no authority to zone agriculture, and then under another law, they have no authority to regulate any condition or activity occurring on an animal feeding operation. Okay? All right.
Were you going to do it or me?
I was going to ask just one final call for questions. Oh, we got one more right here.
As wet as it's been the last few years, we've seen a lot of tiling going on in my areas, out in my counties and the neighboring counties. How is your feel for the legislature as far as looking at tile outlets as, currently they're non-point solution, non-point pollution sources, but obviously the other side looks at that, and it is kind of sometimes hard to argue, here's a pipe coming out of the ground, water coming out of it, that's not a point I can identify. How you feel maybe the legislature's looking at that, or got any thoughts on that?
That would be at the federal level, because right now the ag runoff is exempt from the Clean Water Act, so that would be kind of more of a federal level things. I don't know.
Not to interrupt, but states can be more strict, so we got to be careful there. But go ahead, Ed. No effort that I know of to. I mean, the reason tile lines are non-point sources is because they have this large area you can't control. Way back, the Clean Water Act in the 70s was, let's regulate those areas that can be controlled, and non-point sources can't be controlled because of Mother Nature. Nothing's changed that way. I think, so that's why they're non-point, even though it comes to one point where it's discharged, and that was the issue in the Des Moines Water Works case. For me to answer your question directly, I'm not aware of any activity or effort to change how tile lines are regulated.
Yeah, I think the approach that we've taken is more of how can we use adaptive management on infield drainage. If we look at some of the practices in the nutrient reduction strategy when it comes to edge of field practices like saturated buffers and bioreactors, how can we scale up implementation of those? And so one of the things the Iowa Pork Producers has done is actually gifted money to the Department of Agriculture to use in their cost share program specifically for pork producers across the state who apply to for state funding and cost share to put in edge of field practices. I think that's the approach that we continue to take is how do we use adaptive management and drainage management to scale up conservation practices with this new technology that we see in the state of Iowa to help nutrient runoff on fields.
I've just heard the argument from some people on the other side that say, okay, if you say yourself, we're going to have this voluntary system that we're going to make sure that we apply our manure, our nutrients, whether it's commercial or manure, and say we're going to try to change our management practices, you're almost admitting you do have control over that vast area. And when you put in a bioreactor, you're almost saying we do have some systems, and that is a point source because you're looking at it. You're trying to filter that out, so you're kind of admitting that you have control over this thing, but before you were saying you don't have control over. I'm just kind of wondering if it's if that's kind of some other argument that I've heard.
Well, I think that it ties back to what our industry has always stood on of continuous improvement. If we look at how we've managed nutrients over the years and how we manage nutrients today, go listen to Dan Anderson's presentation later tomorrow about the improvements we've made on nutrient management and manure management in this state and how we continue to do better. I think that speaks to that as well.
And I think the point you're making is, in the court of public opinion anyway, the concern is don't take remedial action. That's a lawyer or legal, but don't take remedial action because that would mean you're admitting you had a problem you needed to fix. The court system generally does a very good job of whatever area of the law you're in of trying to discourage that line of thinking that would prevent people from trying to fix something because they would be admitting there's a problem. So I would say from the legal side of things, no, we shouldn't worry about that at all. We should do whatever we can to minimize our impact, and I don't think that will drag us into being a point source.